I've been invisible for 2 years. That's not a complaint. It's a skill I've spent every single day inside Walker's estate carefully perfecting. You learn the architecture of a house like his the way you learn a language. Not through study but through survival. You memorize which floorboards announce weight, which hallways carry sound further than they should, which rooms he crosses through at 6:47 a.m. with his coffee still steaming and his mind already 3 moves ahead of every person in the city. You learn these things not because anyone teaches you, but because being in the wrong place at the wrong time in a house like Walker's is not the kind of mistake you get to make twice. My name is Han. My title, officially, is Archival Assistant, which is a clean way of saying I am the person trusted to touch the things that must never be touched by the wrong hands. For 2 years, I have cataloged, cross-referenced, and organized the paper memory of an empire whose true architecture lives nowhere on any public record. I do it quietly. I do it correctly. And when I am finished, I disappear back into the silence of the library stacks as though I was never there at all. That is the arrangement. That has always been the arrangement. Walker himself is a presence I have learned to sense rather than see. The shift in atmospheric pressure when he enters a wing, the particular quality of quiet that falls over his staff when he moves through a room. Dark suit always. Open collar sometimes when the hour is late and the meetings have run long. Eyes the color of storm water over concrete that move across a space with the systematic efficiency of someone who has built his entire life on the discipline of noticing things other people miss. He has never in 2 years looked directly at me. I have made certain of it. The reason I am careful has nothing to do with fear of him, or not only that. It has to do with Milo. My brother is 19, studying engineering at a state school 40 minutes from the city, living in a dormitory that costs more per semester than I used to make in 4 months at my previous job. Our father's medical debt, $61,000, accumulated across 14 months of treatment that ultimately failed, does not care about semester schedules or archival salaries. It is patient and it is permanent and it sits at the edge of every decision I make like a shadow that never quite leaves regardless of where the light is coming from. Walker's estate pays 3 times what the records firm downtown offered. The work is solitary, which suits me. The hours are structured, which I need. And the one unspoken rule that governs every member of his household staff is the same rule I have lived by my entire adult life. Do not become a problem. For 2 years I was very good at that. Then on a Tuesday evening in November, in the transit tunnel beneath the Caldwell Street station, a group of men who worked for someone named Vane decided I was useful. Not as a person. As a message. They knew my name. They knew where I worked. They knew with a specificity that told me this was not opportunistic but researched, that I was the woman who handled Walker's most sensitive archives. They wanted to know what I knew. They communicated their interest the way men like that always do, not with words first, but with the kind of physical persuasion designed to leave marks visible enough to read from a distance. The message they told me before they left was for the boss. I took the subway home. I pressed a cloth to my face in the fluorescent light of the train car, and watched my own reflection in the dark window across from me, and made the only calculation available to a woman in my position. If Walker knew there was trouble attached to my name, I would be dismissed before morning. The estate could not afford complications. I could not afford to lose the estate. So I bought concealer on the way home. The expensive kind, the kind that could cover what they'd left on my face. And the next morning I arrived at work 8 minutes early, as I always did. And I walked the familiar hallways of Walker's empire and I told myself that I was still invisible. I was wrong. The one thing I had forgotten, the one thing I had allowed myself to forget in 2 years of careful, deliberate anonymity, was that Walker had built everything he owned on the discipline of noticing things other people missed. And he had been watching me for much longer than I knew. Please, if you are listening, stories like this aren't just about power. They're about the choices behind it. If this one pulled you in, please subscribe and stay with the channel. More stories like this are coming. The library was the safest room in the estate because it was the one Walker entered least. That was the first thing I mapped when I took the position. Not the exits, not the kitchen schedule, Not the rotation of the security detail that moved through the grounds with the quiet efficiency of men who had long since stopped needing to announce their presence. I mapped Walker's patterns. Where he moved and when. Which rooms he occupied for how long and at what hours. Not out of fascination, though I understood why someone might be fascinated. Out of the same instinct that makes small animals memorize the hunting routes of larger ones. The library sat at the north end of the estate's second floor, insulated from the main corridor by a narrow anteroom that swallowed sound. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a single arched window that faced the garden, and the kind of stillness that accumulates in spaces where people think rather than speak. My workstation occupied the far corner, a long oak table stacked with archive boxes, a cataloging system I had built from scratch in my first 3 weeks, and a lamp that cast a warm circle of light just wide enough for the work at hand. I arrived each morning at 7:40 a.m. I left each evening at 6:15. In between, I processed, cross-referenced, and organized documents that I had learned early never to read more than was strictly necessary. That boundary was not given to me as an instruction. It was something I understood instinctively about the kind of material that passed through my hands, the kind of man whose memory I was tasked with keeping. Milo called every Sunday, sometimes Wednesday if the week had been hard, which lately the weeks frequently were. He was studying for his material science exam, he told me, eating badly, sleeping worse, exactly as I had at his age, except I had not had someone quietly absorbing the financial weight of it from the other end. I did not tell him that. I would not have known how to say it without making it a burden rather than a gift. $61,000 does not diminish quickly on an archivist's salary, but it diminishes. That was what I told myself on the mornings when the number felt too large to stand beside, that it was moving even slowly in the right direction. Walker, on those same mornings, was already somewhere in the estate conducting business I understood only in outline. I heard his voice occasionally through walls, low and even, the tone of a man who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. Once I passed him in the east corridor, close enough to register the precise cut of his jacket, the stillness he carried in his shoulders like something load-bearing, and I stepped aside and looked at the floor, and he moved past me without pause. He did not know my name. I was certain of it. I found that arrangement perfect. I intended to keep it that way. The Caldwell Street station was the kind of place that had been almost renovated several times. You could see it in the infrastructure: new lighting fixtures installed over old water stains, fresh paint applied to walls whose cracks had simply grown through it, turnstiles upgraded, while the tunnel connecting the northbound platform to the street exit remained exactly as it had been for 30 years. Dim, narrow, and long enough that the entrance and exit were never visible simultaneously. I had walked that tunnel 400 and something times. I had stopped counting. It was 6:31 p.m. when they fell in behind me. I registered them the way I registered most things, peripherally, categorically, filed under a heading and assessed for risk. 3 men. Spacing that was too deliberate for coincidence. The particular quality of purposeful movement that announces itself to anyone paying attention. I was always paying attention. It hadn't always been enough. They waited until the midpoint of the tunnel, where the acoustics swallowed sound and the nearest camera had been spray-painted over sometime in the past month. This too was deliberate. This had been mapped in advance, the same way I mapped Walker's hallways, except these men were not interested in staying out of anyone's way. The one who spoke knew my name. That was the first thing that told me this was not opportunistic. He knew where I worked. He knew my schedule, my route, the approximate contents of the work I did inside the estate. He used the word archives with the confidence of someone who had been briefed rather than someone guessing. And he communicated what he wanted in clear, unambiguous terms: information about Walker's logistics, his contacts, the organizational structure of documents I had been trusted to handle. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. The conversation did not last much longer after that. What they left on my face was not random. It was legible, the kind of damage designed to be read by a specific audience. A bruise along the cheekbone, a split at the corner of my lip, the swollen pressure beneath my left eye that would deepen through purple into something spectacular by morning. One of them held my chin between his thumb and forefinger at the end, tilting my face as though inspecting workmanship, and told me to make sure the boss saw it. Then they walked out the far end of the tunnel and were gone. I stood still for a moment that was probably shorter than it felt. Then I straightened my jacket, picked up my bag from where it had landed against the wall, walked the remaining length of the tunnel and up the stairs into the cold evening air. On the train home, a woman across the aisle looked at my face and then quickly away. I understood the instinct. I had practiced the same one my entire life. By the time I reached my apartment, I had already decided. Walker would not see it. Nobody would. I would handle this the only way I knew how. In silence and alone. I spent 40 minutes in front of the bathroom mirror the next morning. The concealer I had bought was good, the kind sold in small, expensive quantities to people who understood what coverage actually meant. I applied it in layers the way the tutorial I'd watched at midnight had demonstrated, building opacity gradually rather than packing it on and hoping. Foundation over that. Setting powder. A precise application of blush to counteract the gray that shock leaves under skin tone. When I was finished, I looked almost normal. The swelling beneath my eye had stiffened overnight into something harder to disguise than color alone, but I had done what I could. A high collar on my blouse addressed the bruising at my throat. My hair, worn down rather than pulled back as usual, covered what the collar didn't reach. I arrived at 7:40. I signed in at the staff entrance. I walked the corridor to the library anteroom without making eye contact with anyone I passed, which was not unusual behavior for me and therefore registered as nothing. The morning was quiet. I cataloged. I cross-referenced. I did not think about the tunnel, or the man who had held my face like something he owned, or the way my hands had trembled on the subway platform this morning while I waited for the train and could not make them stop no matter how deliberately I breathed. I did not think about any of it. At 11:20, I left the library to return a set of folders to the administrative annex on the first floor. The route I preferred took me along the east corridor, wide, well-lit, reliably empty at that hour. Today it was not empty. Walker was coming from the opposite direction, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never needed to navigate around anyone in his own house. He was in a dark suit, no tie. A phone held loosely at his side with the expression of someone whose morning had involved conversations he found more irritating than concerning. His eyes were already scanning the corridor ahead with that particular systematic quality I had catalogued and memorized and taken careful pains never to be the subject of. The corridor was narrow enough that passing required acknowledgement. I moved to the right. I looked at the folder in my hands. I performed invisibility with every technique available to me. He stopped. Not paused, stopped. A complete, deliberate cessation of movement that I felt before I registered it visually. And then, for the first time in 2 years, I heard him direct words at me rather than past me. "You're the archivist." It was not a question. His voice at close range was exactly as I had catalogued from a distance. Low, even, carrying the particular weight of someone who said precisely what they meant and nothing adjacent to it. I looked up. I kept my face neutral and my hair exactly where it was. "Yes," I said. His eyes moved across my face with the same systematic efficiency he applied to every room he entered. Something shifted in them, not dramatically, not in any way I could have described to someone else, but enough that my carefully maintained stillness required considerably more effort than it had a moment before. "What's your name?" he said. "Han," I said. He looked at me for one more second. Then he continued down the corridor. I did not exhale until I heard the door at the far end open and close. My hands, I noticed, were trembling again. This time I could not entirely blame the tunnel. He came to the library that evening at 7:03 p.m. I knew this because I was still at my table, running 40 minutes past my usual departure time to finish a cataloging sequence I had been too distracted to complete correctly on the first attempt. I had reindexed the same box 3 times. My concentration, reliable under every previous condition my life had presented, had been quietly dismantling itself since the corridor encounter that morning and rebuilding itself wrong. I heard him before I saw him. Not his footsteps. The anteroom carpet absorbed those. but the specific quality of silence that preceded him, the way air pressure changes before weather. He appeared in the library doorway and stopped there, which was different from entering. He was still in the same suit. He had been in meetings, I knew, for most of the afternoon. I had heard the low architecture of voices from the study below when I passed the stairwell at 3 p.m. None of that showed on him. It never seemed to. He looked at me across the length of the room with an expression I had no established category for. Then he walked toward me. I set down what I was holding. I stood because sitting while he stood felt like a tactical disadvantage I couldn't afford. I kept my hair where it was. I kept my face composed. I told myself, completely fine. He stopped on the other side of my work table. This close, in the warm specific light of my desk lamp, the distance between us was insufficient for the kind of careful management I had been practicing all day. He was looking at my face the way he had in the corridor, methodically, without the social pretense of looking away. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded handkerchief, white silk. He opened it with one hand and then, before I had processed what was happening, he reached across the table and pressed it gently against my cheekbone. I did not move. I was not certain I was breathing. He drew it back. The fabric carried a precise transfer of color. The concealer, the foundation, the careful 40 minutes of architectural concealment I had constructed before dawn. He looked at what the makeup had been covering with an expression that was very still and very controlled, and underneath both of those things, something that had no stillness in it whatsoever. He set the handkerchief on the table between us. Then he leaned forward slightly, closing the remaining distance by a margin that was not accidental, and he said it. Quietly. So quietly that the words seemed less heard than felt. A vibration that moved through the library's stillness and found me with absolute precision. Who hurt you? 3 words. The most dangerous sound I had ever been in the same room with, not because of the volume, which was barely above silence, but because of what lived underneath it. A certainty. A decision already made, waiting only on the answer. I realized, standing in the lamplight of my own library with Walker's eyes on my face and his handkerchief between us like evidence, that I had made a significant miscalculation. He had always been watching, and now he had stopped being patient about what he saw. I didn't answer his question that night. What I did instead was what I had always done when a situation exceeded the boundaries of what I knew how to navigate. I retreated into precision. I told him the men hadn't given names. I told him it was a random assault in the tunnel, that I had handled it, that it would not affect my work. I used the word unfortunate. I used the phrase no ongoing concern. I delivered all of it in the measured, even tone I had spent years cultivating for exactly these kinds of moments when the truth was too large to hand to another person without losing something in the transaction. Walker listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded once, in the way of someone who has heard not only what was said but the precise shape of everything left out. He picked up the handkerchief from the table. He left the library without another word. I believed for approximately 14 hours that I had managed it. At 9:17 the following morning, one of Walker's senior staff, a composed, gray-suited man named Reeves, who functioned as the operational nerve center of the estate and who had never previously spoken to me directly, appeared in the library doorway and informed me that my presence was required in the main study. Walker was standing at the window when I arrived. On his desk were 3 photographs, printed on plain paper, placed side by side with the deliberate arrangement of someone presenting evidence. The photographs were of me, taken at the Caldwell Street entrance, in the tunnel, and on the platform. Timestamps in the corner. The men around me were visible in 2 of the 3. They have been in that tunnel on 4 separate evenings this week, Walker said, without turning from the window. The first 2 nights you weren't there. The 3rd night you were. I looked at the photographs. Something cold and structural shifted in my chest. They know your schedule, he continued. They know your route. They know your brother attends Meridian State, and that he takes the campus shuttle on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He turned from the window then, and his expression was the one I had seen in the library, completely controlled, and underneath that control, something that had already moved well past deliberation into conclusion. This was not random, Han. He said my name the way he had said everything else, precisely without ornamentation, as though it were simply the accurate word for a specific thing. He told me what would happen next without framing it as a request. A suite on the estate's third floor, the private wing, would be prepared by afternoon. Reeves would arrange for Milo to be relocated to a safe house the estate maintained outside the city. Both arrangements were temporary, he said, until the situation was resolved. I asked him what resolved meant in this context. He looked at me steadily. It means finished, he said. By 4 p.m., Milo's voice on the phone was confused but safe, already inside a place whose address I had been given and immediately memorized. By evening, I was standing in a room on the third floor of Walker's estate. Warm, quiet, overlooking the garden, and the line between where his world ended and mine began had blurred into something I no longer knew how to locate. Walker was gone by the time I came downstairs at 6 a.m. I knew this the way I had always known things about his movements, through absence rather than announcement. The estate had a particular quality of stillness when he was present, a low-frequency hum of readiness that ran through every person on staff like a current. That morning the current was off. The rooms felt like rooms rather than extensions of a consciousness that was always on some level running calculations. Reeves confirmed it when I found him in the corridor outside the administrative office, already dressed and already, by the economy of his expression, managing something he had been managing since before dawn. "Mr. Walker is attending to business," he said, which told me nothing and, by the precise way he said it, was designed to. I went to the library. I catalogued. I cross-referenced. I did the work that had always been my anchor when everything surrounding it was moving too fast to hold. By noon, things were reaching me in fragments. The estate staff communicated in a register I had spent 2 years learning to read, not in words, but in the adjustment of schedules, the rerouting of personnel, the particular quality of efficiency that crosses into urgency when the people performing it are too disciplined to show urgency openly. Deliveries that were redirected. A meeting canceled without rescheduling. 2 members of the security detail who had been on the grounds that morning and were not on the grounds by afternoon. By evening, other things were reaching me. Milo called from the safe house, voice carefully casual in the way he used when he was trying not to alarm me. He had seen something on the local newsfeed, a brief item, vague in the way that city crime reporting is vague when the details are too specific to print safely. A syndicate-connected operation on the east side disrupted. 3 individuals detained by circumstances the report declined to elaborate on. I thanked him for telling me and told him to stay where he was. After I hung up, I sat in the chair by the third-floor window and looked at the garden below, and allowed myself to understand what was happening in the parts of the city I couldn't see. Walker had not gone to attend to business in the ordinary sense of that phrase. He had gone to deliver the kind of communication that did not travel through conventional channels. By midnight, Reeves passed my door and paused and told me, without being asked, that everything was progressing as expected. It was the most informative thing he had said to me in 2 years. I lay in the unfamiliar bed of the third-floor suite and listened to the estate settle around me and thought about the men in the tunnel, their confidence, their certainty, the absolute assurance of people who believed they existed outside the reach of consequence. I wondered if they still believed that. I thought, with a clarity that troubled me slightly, that I hoped they didn't. He came back at 2:14 a.m. I knew the precise time because I had not slept, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness that settles in when your nervous system has decided that rest is a luxury the current situation has not yet authorized. I had been at the window for most of the night, watching the garden below shift through gradations of blue darkness, and when the vehicles came through the estate gate I counted them out of habit. 2 Walkers and one I didn't recognize. I heard him on the stairs 11 minutes later. His footsteps were different, not in rhythm but in weight. Something carried differently than when he had left. I told myself to stay in the room. I was in the corridor by the time he reached the landing. He saw me immediately, which I should have anticipated. Walker saw everything immediately. He had stopped being surprised by things I suspected a very long time ago. He was still in his suit jacket, though something had happened to the left sleeve at the cuff. His face was unmarked. Whatever the night had cost him was not visible in the places faces usually record a price. But he looked at me standing in the corridor in the dim overnight lighting of the estate's third floor, and something in him underwent a change I felt rather than saw, a structural shift, like a load-bearing wall registering weight it had not previously acknowledged carrying. "You should be asleep," he said. "You should have told someone you were back," I said. Neither of us addressed the fact that I had meant him specifically. He moved toward the corridor's end where the private study adjoined his rooms, and I fell into step beside him without making the decision to do so, which was its own kind of information about where the past week had relocated whatever boundary I had once maintained. He didn't tell me to go back. That too was information. In the study he sat, not in the chair behind the desk where he conducted business, but in one of the two chairs by the cold fireplace where no business lived. He set something on the side table, his cufflinks. Then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the unlit grate with the expression of a man who has completed something and is now, in the silence after, allowing himself to understand what it cost. I sat in the other chair. For a long time neither of us spoke. The estate was absolutely quiet around us. The kind of quiet that only exists in the hours between very late and very early when the world has briefly stopped requiring anything from anyone. "I miscalculated," he said finally. "How exposed you were. I gave you access I should have protected more carefully. That is not something I will repeat." It was, I understood, the closest he was structurally capable of coming to "I am sorry." "Walker," I said quietly. He looked up. "They didn't get anything," I said. "I didn't tell them a single thing." He looked at me for a long moment with an expression that had nothing controlled in it, which was, I was realizing, the most dangerous version of him. Not the stillness, not the precision. This, unguarded and raw, and looking at me like I was something he had come very close to losing before he understood what I was. "I know," he said. "That's not what concerns me." The fire remained unlit between us. Neither of us moved to light it. Neither of us moved at all. I found the trail by accident. That is what I told myself afterward, though I understood even as I thought it that it wasn't entirely true. It was the scent that led me, ozone and cold machinery, and underneath both of those something copper dark that I recognized despite having no prior experience to recognize it from. It threaded through the estate's lower service corridor at 3 a.m., 2 nights after Walker's return, when I had gone downstairs for water and found instead a door to the grounds left open by a margin too deliberate to be careless. Walker did not do things carelessly. I followed the path across the estate's rear grounds in the cold, through the maintenance yard, to a structure I had catalogued in my mental map of the property but never had reason to approach. The private hangar sat at the property's eastern edge, low and wide, its aviation-grade doors closed but leaking light from the seam at the base. A smaller access door on the side was unlocked. I should have gone back. I catalogued the thought, assessed it, and kept walking. The interior was vast and cold and lit by the unforgiving overhead fluorescence that industrial spaces use because no one inside them has ever required comfort. Walker's jet occupied the far end, dark and still. The center of the space was where the light concentrated and where he stood. He heard me enter. He didn't turn immediately. He finished what he was doing first, which told me everything about the state of the situation. He was in different clothes from earlier, dark and practical, and he was wiping his hands with the methodical thoroughness of someone completing a task rather than concealing one. I looked past him. The men from the tunnel were there. All 3. I recognized them in the way you recognize things seen briefly in bad light. Not the specific features but the arrangement, the sizing, the particular way one of them had stood in that corridor with his thumb against my jaw like I was an object he was appraising. They were restrained and present, and they were looking at me with an expression I had not seen on any of their faces in the tunnel. Fear. Absolute and unperformed. Walker turned then and looked at me across the hangar with an expression that was neither apologetic nor proud. simply present, allowing me to see what I was seeing without managing my reaction to it. I looked at the men who had broken something in me in that tunnel, who had calculated that I was a convenient surface on which to write a message, that I was small enough to be useful as a symbol, that the woman who quietly organized another man's empire was a negligible instrument to be used and discarded. I looked at them for a long moment. Then I looked at Walker. He had crossed a city's worth of darkness in 48 hours for this. Not for his business. Not for the integrity of his operation or the message it sent to his enemies. The files proved I already carried more of his trust than I had known. He could have replaced what I knew. He could not have replaced what he had decided I was. I understood that now with the clarity that the hangar's cold light made impossible to soften. "Are you done?" I asked. His eyes moved across my face, the same systematic attention he had given it in the library, but without the concealer between us now. Nothing between us now. "Yes," he said. I nodded once. Then I turned and walked back toward the estate, and I heard him fall into step behind me, and neither of us said another word, and the silence between us was entirely different from every silence that had come before. The debt notice arrived in my email at 6:47 a.m. I was already awake, already at the window of the third-floor suite, watching the city's skyline negotiate its transition from black to the particular gray-violet that precedes actual dawn. My coffee was hot. The estate below was quiet in the way it was quiet when everything had been resolved and the machinery of Walker's world was running at its resting state rather than its operational one. The email was from the collections firm that had managed my father's medical debt for the past 3 years. 3 lines. Formal language. The account had been paid in full by a third-party settlement. No further balance was outstanding. The reference number meant nothing to me. The date stamp was 2 days ago. I read it 3 times. Then I set my phone face down on the windowsill and looked at the skyline and allowed myself to feel the specific weight of $61,000 lifting from the architecture of every decision I had made for 3 years. It was not a dramatic sensation. It felt, more than anything, like a door I had forgotten was closed finally swinging open onto a hallway I now had no map for. I heard Walker's footsteps on the corridor at 7:15. I had learned, over 9 chapters of careful attention, to distinguish them from every other sound the estate made. He stopped at my door. Knocked once, a formality I understood from a man who owned every surface he was standing on. I told him to come in. He stood in the doorway in his morning suit, coffee in hand, and looked at me at the window with the expression he had stopped concealing sometime between the library and the hangar. Unguarded. Certain. The face of a man who has made a decision and is no longer in the process of making it. "You saw the email," he said. "You could have told me," I said. "I'm telling you now." I looked at him across the room, this man who had built an empire on the discipline of noticing, who had seen me when I had perfected invisibility, who had crossed the city's darkness because something in him had already decided what I was before I understood it myself. "My contract," I said. "The archival position remains yours," he said. "The terms have changed." I waited. "You'll work beside me," he said. "Not for me." Outside the window, the sun finally cleared the skyline, not gradually but decisively, the way light arrives when it has somewhere specific to be. It moved across the estate's grounds and touched the garden and filled the room with the first honest warmth of the morning. I thought about the girl who had arrived at this estate 2 years ago with a cataloging system and a rule about invisibility and 61,000 reasons to stay small and unnoticed. I thought about how thoroughly she no longer existed. "The terms," I said, "are acceptable." Walker's expression shifted, not into something warmer exactly, but into something that had no distance left in it, which on him was the same thing. Outside, the city moved into its morning, indifferent and relentless and full of people who would never know that the quiet woman in the North Library had stopped being a ghost. She had decided at last to haunt something worth haunting. If you enjoyed this story and felt the tension, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel. And more Mafia stories are on the way.